Welcome to University Drive, your pathway to the transformational work of University of the Bahamas. Our goal is to build a better Bahamas by shaping tomorrow's leaders today, finding solutions to challenges, and forging new opportunities for growth. University Drive, where faculty, staff, students, and alumni travel the road of progress together with you. Hello, everyone, and welcome to University Drive, a brand new episode in Season 10. Thank you so much for joining us. I'm your host, Tamika Lundy. Our guest for this episode wears many hats. He's a husband, he's a father, he is a professor of history at University of the Bahamas. He is the director of the Antiquities, Monuments, and Museums Corporation. He also is a published author and getting ready to publish another book with a colleague. I am speaking of none other than Dr. Christopher Curry. Hello, Dr. Curry, and welcome. Thank you so much for joining us again. You're becoming a regular.
Well, thank you so much, Ms. Lundy. This is absolutely an honor and a pleasure of mine to be on the show. What an important occasion, and so I'm happy to be here with you.
Thank you so much. Our conversation is a very timely and relevant one. Quite recently, the country paused to reflect and to observe a pivotal milestone in the history of the Bahamas, and that is majority rule. And it was very key to self-determination, it was key to our liberation, and I would dare say it was a key step in our transformation. And so our conversation today is going to be centered on national identity and knowledge transfer within the context of our really trek from majority rule up through independence, the modern era of the Bahamas to where we are today. And I know that might all sound like a lot, but we are going to ensure that our conversation is digestible. And so who best to help us with steering this conversation than Christopher Curry, who has a whole lot of knowledge about our history. In fact, one of the books that you've written related to Black loyalists in the Bahamas, and the other one that's coming out is related to nation formation. So, Chris Curry, what do we mean when we say national identity?
Well, national identity is, of course, our sense of who we are. Right? A sense of who we are is based on a sense of space, place, and I would say a sense of a shared collective memory. We sometimes call that history. And so who we are as a people essentially is what we mean when we talk about national identity.
That's very helpful to help guide this conversation. You know, a lot of times when we have conversations about history, I don't think the intention is for us to entirely consider only our past, but consider our past in relation to our present and our future. And so the other part of this discussion relates to knowledge transfer and national identity. And you've spent a lot of time getting to the truths about the history of the Bahamas. And when you look at and when you think of and consider where we are today, who we are today, not only in terms of our advancement and our successes and achievements, but also when we consider our plight, the blights, where we have deteriorated in terms of our socialization. We are neighbor's keeper, our ability to resolve conflicts or not, violence coming from really a history of violence. When you think about slavery, right?
Mhm.
Buccaneering and piracy. And so when we talk about national identity, who we are now, and really knowledge transfer, because you and I had a conversation before where you were saying that the Bahamas really is a society based on oral traditions. Are we doing all that we should be in terms of transferring who we are into younger generations? First of all, refining and defining who we are, and then transferring that. And that might be a convoluted and loaded question, right? But I know you're good for it.
So let's get started in the meat of the matter. When we think about who we are as people, the first thing is we have to determine that we're different. We're different from our Caribbean contemporary societies, our territorial areas that make up the circum-Caribbean region. I always argue in classes at UB, particularly my law students, that I say the Bahamas is definitely a part of the Caribbean, but we have unique anomalies in our history and trajectory into the present. For example, you mentioned slavery. We had slavery in the Bahamas established as early as 1648 with the arrival of the Lutheran adventurers, but we never developed a slave society based primarily on the production of a single export crop. As you would have seen in many of the sugar islands in the Caribbean, like Jamaica and Barbados, and even the Spanish territories like Cuba. What we had instead was a non-plantation slave-holding society. So a slave-holding society is different from a slave society. The idea is that there are other economic opportunities or initiatives outside of that single export crop. So as you know, our islands are small and flat, and we're an archipelago. And so we did not have massive islands with rich alluvial soil that would produce an export crop of substance for a sustained period of time. And that shapes our identity. That shapes who we are. We do have slavery, and we have a racial code embedded in our legal system that purports and carries a ideological element of enslavement. So even if we were not a slave society, we were a society of enslaved persons, which meant that we carried a lot of the weight of an ideology that said that persons who were enslaved were chattel, right? That were not human beings. And so that racial ideology still existed in the Bahamas, even if the economic system and the geography of our islands did not allow for a slave society to take hold. All of that is important, understanding who we are as a people, because from our inception, when we were colonized by the British vis-a-vis the Lutheran adventurers, we emerged as a people that were kind of marginalized in the whole British Empire system. We were on the margins of the margin because we did not produce an export crop. We were not a colony that was admired, or even a colony that produced enough revenue to consider to be important. Yet our location in the Atlantic, our location north of the region of the West Indies, our location close to the 13 colonies, later the United States, made us geopolitically significant. Our location, because we were between the New World and the Old, providing shipping lanes to convoys of ships traveling back to European markets, meant that we were important. Hence the need for lighthouses, hence the need for the British to maintain the Bahamas as an effectively occupied post. Hence the need for the British to establish a British Admiralty Court or Vice Admiralty Court in Nassau, despite us not really having an export crop. All these things speak to the importance of us being maintained, effectively occupied by the British, despite our marginality as an economic space. And so we emerge in this colonial period as a society with scars, with the scars of slavery and colonialism, but also understanding that economically we were also scarred. We had to find ways and means to make a living, understanding our islands were rocky, had thin soil, didn't amount to much, and we were not considered much in the big scheme of the British Empire. And so we resorted to things like wrecking. We resorted to things like bootlegging. And during blockade running, we breached the blockade to transport contraband goods, illegal to the United States and the Union forces led by Abraham Lincoln and Ulysses Grant. And of course, supplying the Confederate forces with those weapons in exchange for cotton. So we took advantage of these opportunities. But what's fascinating, Ms. Lundy, is all of these economic opportunities did not come from the land. It came from the sea, whether it be pirating, whether it be private blockade running, and even more recently, drug smuggling and human smuggling. All of these are done on the sea, on our waterways. And so we have to imagine ourselves as a people with a collective memory a storehouse of memories and ideas that have shaped us into who we are, and it's largely based on sea-based activities. What's fascinating, as you know, recently, last year, there was a movement underfoot to change our national sport from cricket to sailing. And I believe that was intentional, given what our identity is as a people, that we understand the sea as this place of sustenance, a place that we can go to for economic survival. And so sailing represents that in many ways. The competitions actually began out of these workboats that were used by fishermen throughout the out islands, as they were called back then, because they were truly marginalized. They were on the margins of the margin. But those workboats were transformed into vessels of honor that could be raced in regattas as they emerged by the 1950s and 60s. And now it's our national sport. And I happened to look at the schedule that was just posted recently. There are now regattas in almost every major island in the Bahamas. They even have a best of the best here in New Providence. And so that speaks to our identity, as does the fact that we were so much relying on the mailboat for so many years, these out island communities, before we decided to change the name to family islands. The mailboat was the lifeline for people, again, thinking about how important the water is, and vessels that traverse the shoals and reefs of the archipelago to get to these far-flung and remote communities to service them with food. The mailboat really was the lifeline to many communities in our archipelago. So there's so much that could be said about our past and how we are identified as islanders in the sea. Islanders in the sea, struggling to survive. And by the way, the sea is both opportunity and tragedy, right? Because you know that it is the sea that produces Category 4 and Category 5 hurricanes like Dorian. So it is both the place of treasure and tragedy. Treasure because, of course, we pull up from the sea lobster and conch that we use to sustain us and to sell to the Japanese and the US markets. But it is also the sea that wreaks havoc on our communities through the power of the hurricanes, that feeds on the warm water that envelops our islands. So that is something to consider, that we are islanders in the stream. And that is how we get a sense of who we are from the past, from our history.
Well, thank you so much for that wonderful context and trek from history all the way to present time. I think that's very important for us to set the tone and the context for the conversation that we are having, coming from a history of being a society of enslaved persons bearing scars, right? And when you said scars, I'm thinking about the scars of the past and the ones that we are creating in the present that might have a footprint in the future. And when you mentioned us with a collective memory, to what extent are we reinforcing our collective memory? Who are we as a people in terms of the values that we hold dear today? When I think of national identity and Bahamians, I think of things like us being resilient, us having an indomitable spirit. I think of us being industrious, of us being economically ambitious, of us being adaptable, right? And so knowledge transfer and transferring who we are we doing enough of that with our younger generations, with our middle-aged generations? Are we doing enough of that amongst ourselves so that we can continue to remind ourselves really of who we are, the values that we hold dear, so that we can aspire to live and be and act in the way that a people should act that comes from a heritage of being adaptable and indomitable and resilient, and not subscribe to these vices that are tearing us apart, violence that is perpetuating itself on our streets and in our homes. Are we doing enough of that? What do we need to do to make this transfer of who we are, who we were, who we are, who we are developing ourselves to be, who we were destined to become? What are we doing to transfer that knowledge more consistently and sustainably? Another big whole wallop of a question, right?
Yes, very good. I go back to the Bible if I could. You had in Deuteronomy where, you know, the Israelites were considered a chosen people. They had a very interesting history as a people that were considered to be manifested destiny in a sense, to carry a particular history with them, as they traversed the wilderness and then into the promised land, and then as they forged a nation. They were reminded to have on their shoulders, to have on their foreheads written basically their commands. What really meant is, and to mark it on their doorposts. The idea was to constantly be remembering the events of their past, so that they would never forget it. And you know that one of the slogans that we hear out of the Holocaust even today is never forget it, you know, lest it be repeated. And so what I think is, in our time in the Bahamas, there needs to be a constant repetition of what it is that we are, who we are as a people, and that needs to be reinforced regularly. It cannot be just a happen chance kind of once in a blue moon kind of scenario. We need to begin at the core of our educational experience to hammer repeatedly in our students, you know, these concepts. And so there has to be an intentionality, I think, about how we go about, and I want to call it indoctrinating, but I do believe that there has to be a deliberate effort to inculcate in our young people a sense of who we are. But, you know, the problem is a lot of people aren't aware of who we are. So until we understand our past, we're still mired as infants in the present. I believe Marcus Garvey said, a man without knowledge of his past is like a tree without roots. And so we want to make sure that we have a rootedness in who we are first. And once we understand the rootedness of who we are as islanders in the stream, as island people, then we can start to build out, and that knowledge transfer that you're asking about has to be done in a deliberate and systematic way from the earliest ages. We're talking about before we even get to K1 and K2, pre-kindergarten, when they're just toddlers, we should be starting this process. And it should be continued from that level to kindergarten, through to the primary years, into junior high school, all the way up to senior high school, and then tertiary level. And so we need to make sure that we have that path paved for our young people to walk down. That's the road we trod, and that is how we must get to a higher place in our calling.
Well, let's talk about that process then, because, and let's take a step back and talk about the institutions and the people and the stakeholders connected to that process. If you were to envision this kind of ecosystem of knowledge transfer, what would that look like in its ideal form?
Well, you know, we live in of course, in a millennial world, you know, that has already experienced an IT revolution. And so, of course, the way we transfer information can't be the way we used to do it 40, 50, 60 years ago. So the knowledge transfer has to be done by fiber, right? It has to be done electronic. It has to be done in the most effective way. It has to be done through social media outlets. It has to be done through Kindle books. It has to be done through campaigns that target how young people use computers and technology. You know, yes, textbooks are still useful and libraries are important, but more and more we're seeing an information highway is the way to go. And so we have to find new ways of pitching a message that is grounded in ageless and timeless ideas. So I would suggest that, you know, without watering down the message, the way in which the message is carried is significant, very important. And so I'm looking forward to the progression of material, web pages being designed, interactive forums. When we look at our museums and institutions, I have a very deep feeling about museums and places, markers that remind us, give us that mnemonic reminder of who we are. Again, when we look at those sites, they have to also reflect the realities of the IT revolution that we're in now. And so you have to have interactive panels. You have to have holographic images. You have to have digital material. You have to have apps ready and available for people to download on their phones so they can take self-guided tours. All of this is speaking to a larger revolution that needs to unfold, where we tell our history and our past and we transfer knowledge through the new mediums that the masses have at their hands. Miss Lundy, I grew up in an analog age. I didn't see a computer until I was about, I don't know, 13 or 14. And I think I was really privileged, the school that I went to and otherwise, to have access to computer at that age for my generation. My daughter, in contrast, she was literally, it seemed like she was born with a computer, right? By 2 or 3, when she was learning how to read, she was learning how to read through simulated programs on a computer screen, right? So even how she learned how to read was all computer generated. So she's got computers in her blood and IT and digital material from like a much earlier age than I. And so that's just speaking to the gap that we have to bridge in order to get that knowledge transfer. To make our history meaningful, we have to find innovative ways to carry the message. The message may not change, but the way that we carry it has to.
Digital immigrants and digital natives. We are here on University Drive. Our guest is Dr. Christopher Curry. We'll take this break and be back.
Are you ready to take your knowledge or career to new heights? Don't wait to invest in your future. Do it now. How? Earn a professional development certificate from University of the Bahamas. Whether you're looking to enhance your leadership abilities, sharpen your technical skills, or explore a new field entirely, our Continuing Education and Lifelong Learning Center has the ideal course for you. We offer single-phase electrical, ethics in procurement, accounting for entrepreneurship, stop managing, start leading, dynamic presentations, digital marketing, superior customer service, and justice of the peace. We even have courses on smartphone photography, TikTok videos, defensive driving, and interacting with difficult people. Or open the door to new languages with English as a second language, conversational Chinese, and Spanish in the workplace. Our instructors are experts in their fields and they're here to support you every step of the way. Call us at 302-4449. Enroll today.
Here we are back on University Drive. Thanks so much for hanging in with us and listening to the show. Our guest is Dr. Christopher Curry. We're talking about national identity and knowledge transfer. But what I find intriguing is also the work that you've been involved in having to do with nation formation. The Bahamas is 50. This year, University of the Bahamas is 50. Nation formation. You are and a colleague are about to come out with a new book on that very topic. What can you tell us about that in relation to our identity?
Well, one of the things that we notice is, and I'm going to put an outlandish statement out there. There is an argument that much like gender and race, which are, some would argue, academics have argued, are social constructs. There's an argument out there by Benedict Anderson. His work is somewhat dated, but I think his premise is still strong, which is that nationalism is also a social construct, that people engender and create a sense of who we are in order to serve a particular goal. Sometimes it's political, sometimes it's socioeconomic. And so the idea is carried forward by scholars that myself and my co-author, Dr. Tinker, have looked at. And we've looked at, for example, the work of Howard Johnson, published in Yinner Volume 1. He argues that the idea of a Bahamian nation was constructed against the counter-identity of a colonial past in which a minority government had ruled for so long. And so when the PLP become the government in 1967 and then advance the case for independence and create essentially a nation, they're doing so in the environment, in the context of a period of long-term colonialism. And a counterpoint to that is to create then a Black national identity in which the general sense of who we are was related to a collective experience of going through colonialism and enslavement. Now, Howard Johnson argues in that article that in creating this Black counter identity to the period of white minority rule, Penling and his cohorts in the PLP in its early stages championed an African past. And so you would see a number of expressions of that through, for example, the archives at the time had just become a department, putting on an exhibition on slavery, aspects of slavery, through the development and encouragement of Ed Moxey's festival and his Jumbe village. Okay, and there are other examples, but to suggest then that there was a sense of national identity tied to an African past. Well, that in itself is a good thing, right? But then, of course, understand that in the Bahamas, it's complicated to purvey that kind of narrative because you have other minority groups, some who may not identify necessarily with Blackness. You have Greeks, Lebanese, Syrians, Jews, and more recently, Filipinos, etc. You have a white minority too that obviously would not identify with an African past. So these all things were challenges to a unified national identity or the nation as he would create. And so even symbols that we have, some would argue, they reflected that sort of sense of national identity that was trying to be purveyed by the PLP administration. We have a flag, for example, and it's important to note that the flag has three colors, obviously. It has a triangle with a black color. It has gold representing the sand and the sun, I suppose. And then we have the aquamarine, which represents the sea. Of course, people focus on the triangle. And that triangle, the black, represents the strength and vigor of the united people. It's very important that we say that because even I believe Penling in his acumen at the time, his political acumen, realized that if you said that the black represents the people, that you would be marginalizing a group, right? And so he made it clear, or those that were involved in this, it wasn't him by himself, but he was given, of course, advice on this matter from the committee that was formed, that the black would represent the strength and vigor of a united people. And of course, that means that it is representing a character trait, not a phenotypical color of a person. All of these things are important, though. And then if you look at the coat of arms and the symbols that are invoked on it, and our symbols in general, whether it be the lignum vitae, the flamingo, the blue marlin, all of these things speak to our identity as a people, right? And the idea of the project of nation formation. All right, I believe it was a concerted effort to embrace things that were indigenous, but also reflective of our history. So that's why the blue marlin is there. You will also see on the coat of arms what looks like the Santa Maria Columbus ship. All of it speaks to the identity of our people tied to the sea as well. And so I think it's important to understand the idea of nationalism as a social construct, but also to understand that the vestiges of power, the symbols, the national symbols, are all connected to this project of nation formation.
You know, as you were talking, there was this question bubbling up in my mind, and I'm thinking to myself, are societies who know their history, who have a thirst and desire for their history, who have a healthy engagement and connection with their history, museums and reading and historical things fused into national activities that might be happening. Are such societies more orderly, more successful, more and more advanced? What have you found? I mean, the most advanced, the most peaceful, orderly societies, are they ones where they know their history, they have a grasp on their history and a healthy desire and appetite for it?
I do think that generally these symbols of identity, national identity, however they are promulgated to their populations, they do give a sense of order, a sense of pride, a sense of belonging, which I feel is very important. However, of course, where you have societies where people do not feel like they belong, there becomes issues. I can think of a couple of examples from, my knowledge of history, world history. World War I, for example, was started because you had Bosnians, nationalists, Serbian nationalists, who did not want to be a part of an empire anymore, the Austrian-Hungarian Empire, and they didn't feel like they belonged. They felt like they were on the fringe of society, and so they assassinated Archduke Franz Ferdinand when he came into Sarajevo. All right, and we often note that where societies have cleavages, there is because there isn't a shared sense of collective belonging. Even in the U.S. Civil War, we understand that the pivotal issue was on slavery. The South did not buy into what was being promulgated by the Union. All right, and so there's a civil war. We have other examples, but surely, if you do not have a group of people, even if you have a heterogeneous population, meaning you have a diverse, multicultural, polyglot community, there are ways that you can foster a sense of belonging where you even have people of diverse ethnic origins. All right, but that takes work. That takes work. I think about Canada, particularly right now. It's a very multicultural society. They have various different ethnic groups. They have Indigenous persons. They are trying to find that delicate balance and dance. How do you bring people together and give them a sense of a common shared past? Because in Canada's case, it was a very underpopulated country until recent years, and even now it is, and it has issues with its Indigenous past. And yet it is finding a way to keep things coalesced in a relatively peaceful way. In our country, since independence, we have the blessings of 50 years of peaceful transition. We've had fair and peaceful elections every 5 years generally, with a couple of exceptions where elections were called earlier, like the last one. But generally, we've seen the peaceful transfer of power. To me, that's a very good testament to our country and its success. And for the most part, people have a sense of belonging.
Let's talk more about that sense of belonging in terms of the Bahamas. We've seen advancements. Our institutions have developed from our early independence years. Education has improved from when we became independent. Some would argue that it needs to take a further gigantic leap. New Providence in relation to the Family Islands. When you talk about a sense of belonging, right, it's not only important to pay deep attention to economic development, but also social development, right? How do you foster that sense of belonging such that as you develop as an independent nation, you're also fostering those kinds of core values that can help with the socialization that happens with young people? Our communities are more thriving. There's more neighborliness. I don't know. It seems there's less development in the Family Islands. There's more in New Providence. There's less vices in the Family Islands. There's less population. How do you strike kind of like balance so that you have your economic development, but you also have some strong core values and less of the things that can tear your society apart?
Yeah, Ms. Lundy, I feel that this is a central challenge of an archipelagic nation, because for so long, everything has been so Nassau-centric, from social services and healthcare to education. And so the challenge is to not leave anyone behind and to offer the same services, the same opportunities to everyone, regardless. I mean, Ragged Island has a population of under 100 persons, but those 100 persons still need to be served. They still need amenities that would be found in other islands, a school, a port of call, roads that are paved, electricity, cable network, whatever. So the point here is that a sense of belonging has to begin with an inclusive agenda that says we all do belong. And you know, the challenge is historically speaking, the islands that we speak about, the family islands, didn't feel much like a family. They didn't feel like they belonged. They felt like they were like the outside child. We called them the out islanders because they were out there. I can't remember the exact date when we decided to change the name from out islands to family islands, but I know that it was intentional. And even as you look at tourism, right, and the commercials now, they talk about the Bahamas and the islands of the Bahamas to give emphasis again that isn't just Nassau, that a visitor to come here and it could go to many different islands and gain different experiences. But the truth of the matter is the sense of being a family needs to be considered, because in many ways, one would argue that we are a dysfunctional family, right? And the dysfunction comes from the fact that we don't give the same primacy of attention to family island development that we give to New Providence. And that has everything to do with our colonial past, mind you. But as we talk about knowledge transfer and building a nation, it's very important that we find ways to be a more inclusive society, to be a more inclusive people. If it means, for example, and I'm thinking here about, you know, museums and history, and not everyone can come to Nassau and see a fort or see a museum. So what do? We have to create virtual tours so that people in the family islands can go on a virtual tour and see the forts that way, or see the museums that way. So we always have to think of a way to be more inclusive. And I know the University of the Bahamas is also doing this. When you think about tertiary education, how can we be more inclusive to make sure that everyone has an opportunity, everyone has a chance at a level playing field? And so we have to, again, always consider, what is it like for the person in Mayaguana? What is it like for the person in Rumkey? What is it like for the person in Ragged Island as a Bahamian? Do they feel part of the bigger picture? What is it like for people in disadvantaged communities here in Nassau and New Providence? All right. Not everyone has the same pedigree, the same wealth, the same access to cash or monetary finances. And so we have to find a way as best we can to create a level playing field and make and give people a sense of belonging.
How is that playing out for the Antiquities, Monuments, and Museums Corporation in terms of connecting that, you know, inclusivity as a bridge to connecting people with the past and even the present?
Well, that's where we have our living history program, and what we're going to be doing is eventually, you know, we used to think of we have to do a paradigm shift. We used to think about getting people to come to us, to come to our sites, to come to the forts, to come to Pompeii Museum. But now we're realizing, instead of requiring people to come to us, maybe we need to go to the people. And so that paradigm shift means that we use our digital platforms, we create virtual sites. It means that we go into the schools. It means we are able to take some of our programs, including our living history reenactment program, to the schools. So it requires an intentionality to move beyond the traditional way of doing things. And so that's really what I'm speaking about. And I believe that's the mandate too of the University of the Bahamas. But that's certainly what we're thinking about at AMMC.
Certainly. And so let's talk about the schools then. I know that you've been involved in some publications that need to have an audience. And if we're talking about that knowledge transfer, we need to start a little bit earlier with ensuring that our younger generations know from whence they came.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, you know, the important thing is, and I said this earlier, that you have to start from when they're toddlers, from when they're just starting to learn how to read and write, and take that pre-kindergarten experience and have the scaffolding effect, so that at every level you're building on blocks from a previous period in your educational career. What we really want to see is a more robust educational experience that is able to tap into experiential learning, tap into interactive modes of learning, and then also at the same time make it interesting, the stuff that you're reading and doing, so that you're not just reading about history in the past, but you're doing it. We also need to be aware of the fact that there are challenges with access to digital material. All right, and so we have to find a way to bridge that gap. Education is something that needs to be always reconsidered in light of the challenges that we face. So my thought then is the work that we're doing is something that's powerful, because it's tapping into our collective memory, our storehouse of knowledge about who we are. But it has to be something that is connected through all levels of education. And so the scaffolding that needs to take place is something that we're aware of. And so the senior high educators need to be talking with the junior high, need to be talking with the primary, need to be talking with the kindergarten levels, so that we're all on the same page with how we're going to make this revolution occur.
What for you would be next steps?
I feel like for me, next steps would be certainly a concerted effort to address curriculum changes. We're seeing that happening at all levels. I think it certainly needs to be a stakeholders meeting. There needs to be some PR behind this. And there needs to be engagement. Education officers, principals of schools, private and government schools. I really do see a need for more conversation at different levels. So I guess I see that as the next steps.
Very good note for us to take our next break. You're listening to University Drive. Back after this.
Chapter One Bookstore is proud to serve the students, faculty, and staff of the University of the Bahamas and the community at large. We are the premier choice for the purchase of university textbooks and supplies, and UB logo apparel, paraphernalia, and gifts. We also carry a wide variety of school supplies, learning aids, and leisure books. Visit our copy center for all of your printing, copying, and binding needs. Chapter One Bookstore is located on the ground floor of the Michael H. Eldon Complex on University Drive. Shop with us on Monday through Saturday. You can contact us at 397-2650 or email at chapter1@ub.edu.bs. Follow us on Facebook and Instagram at Chapter One Bookstore. Chapter One, the premier choice.
Welcome back, everyone. We're talking with Dr. Chris Curry. Dr. Curry, in all that you've said, the question I have now is national identity of the Bahamas. What is the role, what's the factor that comes to play when we think about and talk about ethnic diversity? We're not a homogenous society. We have different ethnicities that have been among us from a long time ago. One could look at how Bahamians have related to those ethnic brothers and sisters that we have living among us. But is there a role, is there a space and place for us to define and determine ethnic diversities within our national identity?
I think there absolutely is. We need to move away from this outdated way of thinking about race and ethnicity in the Bahamas, where we generally think in binary terms, white versus black. And that has been a narrative that's been popular for some time, given that we, again, came from a kind of past government of white minority, the UBP, Bay Street Boys, then we got majority rule. But the truth of the matter, as I alluded to earlier, is our society is much more polyglot, more multicultural than we may have thought. And so we need to look at and consider the diversity of our experiences in the Bahamas, whether it be along ethnic and racial lines or national lines. We have to understand too that we have a very large population of Haitian descended persons or persons directly from Haiti. We also understand that we have a large population of persons of West Indian descent from Jamaica and Barbados. We have to recognize that they played a role in nation formation as well. We know that our first prime minister's father was Jamaican. We know that persons like Clement T. Maynard's family have roots in Barbados. And so again, accepting and realizing that the narrative that we've woven for so long is one that's a bit clumsy, the binary white versus black, etc. What we need to do is embrace a holistic narrative that speaks to, as Jamaica says, out of many one. All right. Now, we're not going to take theirs, but we have to accept the fact that we are a rich tapestry of diversity. All right. And that speaks to us as a Bahamian people.
I think the stumbling block there is the challenge and the lingering challenge or challenges that we continue to have with regard to illegal immigration and how that's played out and the stresses and pressures on our society. But that shouldn't negate the fact that having different ethnicities among us is a thing. And in fact, Bahamians do go abroad and we contribute in very tangible and commendable ways to other communities and societies and nations. Why is it that when it comes to when those who are different from us live among us, it's one view, but when we go abroad to contribute, it's another view?
Yeah, and I always remind students of the project, the contract where Bahamian agricultural workers went abroad and their remittances were sent back home in a very productive and highly successful labor program. And then if we were to even consider doing something similar to that here in the Bahamas, utilizing agricultural laborers from other countries, a lot of Bahamians would have a fit. Let's just be honest. That just would not sit well with them. It speaks to, unfortunately, the specter of fear that we still have. There's xenophobia is still a big issue in our country. If we were to do a better job of raising awareness of the richness of our history and the multicultural, multifaceted complexity of our immigrant history, going all the way back to the Lutheran adventures and beyond, we would find perhaps then that would help. But again, it starts with education. I do think, though, that there needs to be provision for securing our borders. I do believe that we need to do a better job of policing our neighborhoods. I do believe that we need to regularize those that are already here at the same time. So those two go hand in hand. But certainly we have to remember that there are human rights that need to be acknowledged. And we are, of course, as a country, we are signatories on several United Nations conventions that speak to the protection of the individual and basic human rights. From 1948, the Declaration of Human Rights, all the way through to CEDAW and other treaties that we have signed on to. So it's very important that we acknowledge that our society is changing. And it's very important, too, that we find ways to get along. And rich cultural practices and communities that we see within the Bahamas is something to be celebrated. I know that I always look forward to, Ms. Lundy, the International Cultural Wine and Food Festival every year, because when they have that festival, it's amazing just how many countries are represented. You would have no idea if you didn't attend, really, because we don't always showcase those different communities here in our country.
What is the historical perspective on assimilation? Because, over the years, over many years, we've always had a lot of different groups coming to the islands of the Bahamas, a lot of immigration to the islands of the Bahamas. What is the historical view about assimilation versus a society that is a melting pot?
Well, the theory that I like is actually from Fernando Ortiz. He was a Cuban anthropologist. He came up with transculturation. He says that it's supposed to complicate the idea of acculturation, whereas this idea that it's a one-way street where you basically move to another country and you basically have to accept uncritically the cultural practices and values of the host society. But he's arguing that transculturation is one in which you have opportunities to accept, but also reject, but also include your own hybrid culture or your own ethnic practices and beliefs. And so really, when you think about it, hybridity and transculturation speak to a reality of Caribbean people much more so than acculturation or assimilation. That you have a two-way street, or sometimes more like a six-legged roundabout, to make it more pertinent to the Bahamas. That you have a heterogeneous reality of people that are both learning and are accepting other cultures, other practices, while also expanding and amplifying their own cultural practices and expressions. And so that's what I like about Ortiz's formulation of transculturation. I think it works well in our Bahamian context. We are people much like Kong Salad. We are very much mixed up and a much more heterogeneous group of people than we are a homogeneous group.
Well, that's something to reflect on. What are the lessons? What are the takeaways that we need to always bear in mind as citizens of this nation? Whether we are going about our business and duties here in the Bahamas or abroad, wherever we are, what do we need to bear in mind? Especially now, as we've just reflected on majority rule, we're at the beginning of 2024. What do we need to bear in mind?
I think we need to bear in mind that despite all of the challenges we've faced, whether it be the forces of nature and hurricanes, whether it be a rugged past that's filled with depression years and failures, being able to really not make much out of the land. I think the thing that we have to keep in mind is that we are a resilient people. We are a tough people. We are people that have, my mom used to say, when handed a lemon, make lemonade. I always say we've been making switcher for so long because that's just the indomitable spirit of the Bahamian. And so given that we've had a rough time with our history in a way, and yet we have produced 4 Rhodes Scholars. We've produced amazing athletes and artists. We have some of the most talented performing artists, virtual and otherwise. We have an amazing tapestry of people from different places and different experiences that have come together to love the islands that make up our archipelago. So I think it's the resiliency of us. Like they say in that proverb, time longer than rope. So we hanging on to that rope. And we know that time is longer than rope. So that to me is really captures what it is all about to be a Bahamian, and where we, can really gain a lot of strength and confidence from.
I love your metaphors, switcher and Kong Salad. I love them. I love them. They're giving me the feels. And so we're in January 2024. Chris Curry, what gives you the most hope?
I think what gives me hope is that we as a people have a lot of value. We have the greatest minds and the human spirit, the indomitable human spirit that continues to prod on to a loftier goal. I think the greatest asset of a nation, and I could be speaking of other countries, but I'm speaking specifically of the Bahamas, is the capacity of the individuals to marshal their own ingenuity towards greatness. We have the outside of Australia, the largest barrier reef. We have the largest territory in the Caribbean. We are actually larger than Cuba when you count our waterways. And so, we as a nation have a lot of rich resources, but I have the confidence and the hope reposed mostly in the capacity of our people to be creative geniuses and to develop great ideas for the future.
Very good. That is an excellent point on which we can end. Thank you all so much for listening to University Drive. Thank you, Dr. Chris Curry, for joining us again. As always, this has been a really intriguing conversation for me. You always have an open invitation to join us at any time in the future. Thank you all so much for being here for University Drive. I've been your host, Tamika Lundy. Don't forget to follow University of the Bahamas on www.ub.edu.bs. Follow us on all of our social media channels. This is University Drive. We'll be back next week with another exciting episode.
University Drive is a production of the Office of University Relations at University of the Bahamas. All rights reserved.